Bienvenidos. Welcome to VMworld 2012 in Barcelona. We're going to start today's Tech Talks today with Simon Gallagher. Now, Simon, you were here yesterday with a very fun session, but I like this title too.
Okay.
vTardis. Is there a doctor involved?
There is, later on.
Ah, fantastic.
Sometimes you need a doctor to assist with the brain ache that causes when you build it.
Right. Sonic screwdriver?
More of a manual thing.
Okay, yeah. Understood. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll let you take it on.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. My name's Simon Gallagher. I'm infrastructure architect. So I spend most of my time working with customers designing solutions based around VMware products and Windows infrastructure. So I'm here today to talk about my vTardis project, which has been going for a while. So I guess the kind of initial disclaimer with this, this is in the unsupported sessions today. So pretty much everything I'm going to show you here is unsupported. So you're using this at your own risk. I'll explain why I think it's a good idea, and it's still quite a good middle ground for do this sort of thing. But if you run into this sort of thing, don't be calling VMware. You might have more luck calling Ghostbusters to ask them for help with this sort of thing. So the vTardis project is really around a low-cost lab environment for testing and certifications. So I've been through the mill doing all my VCPs, VCAP, etc., and before that all the Microsoft stuff and all the Citrix things. So I've always had to have quite a lot of lab gear to do this sort of thing. So even if you work for a major vendor, it's very difficult to have equipment that you can just play around with. Having personally worked for VMware myself in the past, even at a massive vendor like that, you can't just have a bunch of hosts to play around with. So I've always invested a lot of my own time and far more of my own money than I probably should have done over the years in buying my own equipment to use at home. So there's a couple of use cases for this. One, so I have a wife. I also have a couple of children who are now becoming very dependent on internet, DSs, PlayStations, all that sort of thing. So I've always had to maintain even a basic level of infrastructure at home to serve video, media, make sure they're not looking at anything really bad on the internet, for example. So I kind of use my lab environment to service some of my sort of essentially production home use cases, but also to provide some equipment that I can play around with new vSphere releases. So for example, when the vSphere 5 product was in beta, I was running all that stuff on my lab here. So there are, whilst this is kind of a personal use case for a bit of professional development, there are some kind of production use case for this if you're doing this in a professional sense in your place of business. So, if you want a bunch of hosts to test some build scripts against, test patching, release management, that sort of thing, unless you've got 32 node clusters sitting around spare that you can play with, which fair play to if you do, this is quite a good way of doing that. So the goal here is to really try and find as cheap as possible ways of getting representative infrastructure that you can play around with. So, as I kind of mentioned earlier, over the years I've probably bought every bit of rubbish off eBay that I've come across. So I've been through having very old PCs running with what was GSX server back in the day and some scripts. I at one point did buy an ML570 from eBay. Which ran fine for about a year until I realized the power company had screwed up my billing with Nextdoor, and they sent me a very large bill for the 600 watts that it was consuming. So that turned out to be quite expensive, so I stopped using that. And at that point, I really started to look at ways of running ESX itself as a virtual machine, so what we call nesting. And that's really the nub of what makes this sort of thing feasible. There's a number of different variants of this project that I've been through over the years. And we'll walk through those in a little bit. So essentially what we're here to talk about is nesting hypervisors. So running virtual machines inside virtual machines, potentially inside virtual machines. So anybody who was here yesterday for William Lamb's session, he had some very good demos around how to set this up, around using auto deploy and things like that to make it a bit more streamlined. So I would definitely suggest you check out that recording from yesterday. But the general proposition is that we can either take a physical ESX5, ideally, host. We can then run a number of ESX virtual machines on that, and then inside those virtual machines we can run more virtual machines. Likewise, with some tweaking and some playing around, we can use other vendors' hypervisors in there. So on my single box, I can run Zen, I can run Hyper-V, and I can run various versions of vSphere all at the same time taking advantage of all things we benefited from in terms of virtualization, but virtualization platforms. Why would you do this? I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's around doing more with less, and it's that use case of where you've not got very much hardware to be able to experiment and play around with this sort of thing. So, you know, I've kind of got a terrible Star Trek quote that you can't defy the laws of physics, but in terms of what you can do with vSphere, you can certainly cheat. So the overall architecture of what vTardis is essentially, you'll see to the bottom of this diagram, there is one physical host, or maybe one or two, depending on which configuration you put this into. So that is what you have to go out and buy. Okay, no one's going to give you that, generally, unless you can find an old one from work. So you have to find a box of a suitable specification to run at the very bottom of the stack. So on that box, we'll install VMware vSphere, 5 generally these days. Or we'll use Workstation or Fusion, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Then you'll see those kind of orangey boxes on top of that. So on top of that, we're running Virtual Center as a virtual machine, kind of common use case. We'll be using OpenFiler, FreeNAS, or some software-based storage appliance to provide shared storage. And then on this diagram, I'm using vATA, which is a software-based layer 3 router. And then if you imagine, alongside or on top of those, we're then running a number of virtual instances of vmESXi, which on this diagram are the purple boxes. I know somebody at the back can't see this very well, but those purple boxes are ESX operating systems installed inside a virtual machine. So in this example, we've got an 8-node cluster, which is, to all intents and purposes, as far as vSphere sees, is a real cluster. It doesn't really know it's running virtualized. Then the green boxes on top are nested virtual machines. So this is where it starts to get a little bit difficult to visualize this in your mind. So if you imagine we've got one physical box. On that physical box, we're running a bunch of virtual ESX hosts. Then inside those ESX hosts, we will run Windows or whatever, okay? They don't know that they're running inside a virtual machine, which is running inside a virtual machine, which is kind of the beauty of what vSphere does. So just to kind of show what that would look like in the UI, so there have been various variants of how I came to the name of vTardis, but anybody who's kind of a bit geeky and has ever come across Doctor Who, it's around the concept that the TARDIS was a lot bigger on the inside than it looked from on the outside. And it's very true for this. So as I said, we've got one physical server, but as you see, it doesn't necessarily know that the cluster nodes it's managing are virtual machines and that they're actually all running on the same box. So, and I've got a very quick demo just to have a look around what that looks like. So we won't spend too long on this, but if I show you, as long as the video is actually on the screen this time. Okay, so what you'll see here, and apologies for everyone in the audience, this is a bit tricky to see, but if you imagine this is the VI client, this was done with vSphere 4, I should point out, but as far as it's aware, it has an 8-node cluster that it's managing, which it thinks has 17 gigs of CPU resource and 64 gigs of RAM. Don't forget, this is all running one single box that has 8 gigabytes of physical RAM and costs around 200-300 euros. So you'll see to the left at the top, those are the, at the bottom, these are the virtual machines themselves that are running on the physical host. Each one of these is running ESX. So as you'll see, the hardware type it registers is, it doesn't have a hardware type, it's saying it's a virtual machine. Now you can open the console and interact with it here as if it was an ILO connection to a physical box. It is purely a virtual machine, so you can log in and do everything you would do normally. Okay, so you'll have seen there that there's a lot more inside that physical box than meets the eye from the outside, to mix terrible sci-fi references. So, to get into doing that, you can't necessarily do that out of the box. You have to make some unsupported tweaking to allow that to happen. Now, see, VMware over the years have put a lot of investment themselves internally in their engineering in enabling this stuff, because as you can imagine, this makes it easier for VMware themselves to set up test and development environments and to be able to produce new versions of ESX. So, as I kind of mentioned, if you check out William Lamb's blog, which is virtuallyghetto.com, he's got lots of very good, very up-to-date vSphere 5.1 focused step-by-steps for how to turn this on. Now, there are some special considerations when you're choosing your hardware for this that you need to bear in mind. We'll touch on those in a little bit, but it's around certain bits of physical functionality that need to be available on your host to enable it to work with nested ESX. So, and there are essentially two approaches to this, okay? So the approach I've taken over the years is to buy some cheap hardware, physically install ESXi on it, hack around with it a bit, and then build virtual clusters on top of it. Now, that's fine because I have an office and I can leave that kit running at home. And that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and when I'm traveling, I can connect to it and play around with it. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. And for the last couple of releases of Fusion and Workstation, which are the kind of desktop versions, obviously, of VMware's products, they now have that functionality baked in to allow you to install ESX. Now, I'm not entirely certain, if I'm honest, whether it's a fully supported guest OS. So if you go into Fusion, you can create an ESX5 virtual machine, and likewise you can do the same with Workstation on a Windows platform. So I guess the distinction is the ESX itself to install on bare metal is somewhat picky around the hardware it will run on, so you have to bear in mind things like NIC compatibility, CPU type, etc. Whereas Workstation or Fusion will generally install on any bit of hardware you have, because they either sit on top of OS X, which means you're on an Apple platform, or Workstation, which sits on top of Windows platform, and then will run on anything that Windows will run on. So you have a much wider choice of hardware. And particularly these days, as you get laptops, so this laptop here is this big and it has 16 gigs of RAM in it. Most laptops these days can do that, so it becomes quite a useful portable lab you can take around with you to do that sort of thing. And most of the Intel Core i5 and i7 chips, certainly that I've come across, have enough functionality to enable you to do this. So, as I kind of alluded to earlier, you do need to be a little bit careful when you're picking your hardware. And I mean, there's a number of considerations here. One is around the hardware requirements for the CPU to allow the nesting, so these 64-bit virtualization extensions. But you do need to be careful around, if you're going to install ESX natively on something, you do need to be careful around array controllers and network cards, because particularly if you go for some of the cheaper HP servers, the SMB focused ones like the ML 110s, 115s, etc. The array controllers that they come with are really purely software implementation, and they're only really working on a Windows platform. So whilst you can install ESX, all it's going to see is 4 physical disks. It doesn't know, it's not like like an HP P400 or whatever. It's not going to create a RAID set out of that for you. And particularly if you're going to be running this at home, paying for it yourself, hosting it in your house with the rest of your family, you need to be looking at getting something that's cheap to acquire, but that doesn't use very much power, because, as I mentioned earlier, I've been surprised with some nasty electricity bills in the past. But also you need it to be quiet, because nobody really wants a DL380 spinning away in their kitchen or in their dining room. Particularly if you're married, because your wife really doesn't like that. So you got a couple of options. eBay is a great source for second-hand enterprise level gear. So I've bought quite a lot of that sort of thing off eBay. It's cheap. You can pick up a DL380 that's maybe 2 generations old but still quite serviceable for a couple of £100, a few more €100 or dollars. But again, they tend to use a lot of power. You can buy a desktop PC and put bits together yourself, so if you're into that kind of homebrew thing. I think I kind of got out of that a long time ago, but you do have to be very careful about what kind of hardware components you pick and how you can put that together. There are some kind of various community-sourced compatibility lists for white box type approaches, but in my experience it's far easier just to buy something. Maybe that's because I'm lazy, but also because by the time you've put it together, if you find something that's incompatible or doesn't work quite as advertised, the time you're going to spend doing that, you'd be easier just to buy a box, in my opinion. So the specific CPU features you need to be looking for are, obviously it needs to support those VT extensions, which I see pretty much every mainstream chip these days, every 64-bit chip anyway, seems to support the base VT extensions, but the important ones to look for are EPT, so Extended Page Table, and RVI, which is something like Rapid Virtualization Indexing, which is the AMD equivalent. Now, from what I've seen, your best kind of option for this is really in the AMD space. So a lot of the cheaper Intel chips that you can buy, so if you're on eBay looking for a server to do this with, a lot of the Intel chips that those boxes will have in them don't seem to have that EPT support. Now, EPT is important if you want to be able to nest machines inside ESX. If you don't have that, you're unable to do this, whereas even the lower end AMD Opteron chips all seem to, as far as I've seen, seem to come with RVI. So, if you're looking around, AMD ones generally do seem to be your best bet. HP actually have quite a good range of small, medium business servers. So They have this microserver, which we'll see a bit more of in a bit. But these boxes are literally cubes like this. In the UK, they often run these cashback promotions. So they're £120. So after that cashback rebate, so probably what 140, 150 euros. Only constraint being, they don't have the most powerful CPU, and they can only take 8 gigs of RAM. But I have found a very good use for it, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, my favorite still today, this is the HP ML115G5. They're now end of life because they're 2 or 3 years old, but you can still pick them up on eBay. The most I've ever managed to get into it is 8 gigs of RAM, but the reason I quite like it is it has an AMD chip. It's very quiet. This is literally a desktop PC that HP market as a small business server. You can put it under your desk or behind your sofa, and you won't notice it because they're that quiet. And all of the videos I showed you a bit sooner, they were all, a bit earlier, were all produced actually on an ML115G5. So low-cost box. Now, the subsequent generations of those, so the 110G6, and I believe they've got a G7 model now, seem to have lifted the price quite significantly, because those 115s you could pick up at the time for about 200 UK pounds. The lowest I've seen those 110G6s is around about the £400 mark. So by the time you put, they take 16 gigs of RAM, by the time you put the RAM in them, they can work out quite expensive. So, we're kind of getting to that tipping point where the desktop products, so Fusion and Workstation, are actually more than good enough now that you're kind of tipping into the point where it makes sense just to buy something that works for you and install Windows on it and use Workstation to do your vTardis, and not have to be quite so specific about the hardware it's going to run on. There's a link to a friend of mine, Simon Gallagher's site, so techhead.co. So he's got a really good kind of hot deals section on his website, because he and I have collaborated on quite a lot of these lab environments in the past, and he does keep up to date quite a good list, mainly kind of UK focused, but certainly some input for UK and European markets as well, for where he sees things like good deals. So I think I saw one recently where he was talking about SSDs and that sort of thing. So I definitely recommend you check that out. So we'll have a look at a couple of variants that I've been involved in this. So Mace, I don't think Richard's here, but so one of my former colleagues at VMware was putting this together as a proof of concept for a previous VMworld. So unfortunately this didn't get the go-ahead, but it was quite cool in my opinion. So what it was is 32 of those HP microservers. So if you imagine, these are £120 in the UK each, and he bought 32 of them, put 8 gigs of RAM in it, a bunch of local hard disks on there, with the intention of, so if anybody who remembers the vSphere virtual storage appliance, so the concept was to build a 32 node cluster on very low cost hardware, use the virtual storage appliance to essentially build a SAN out of the distributed cheap storage. So if you imagine the total cost for that pile of 32 nodes, which has a reasonable amount of capacity, was somewhere in the region of £3,000. So interesting proof of concept. Unfortunately didn't get the go-ahead, but would have been quite a good use case for using auto deploy and all those sort of things, and the virtual storage appliance. So I've had a Mac Mini that this makes me sound really bad. This makes me sound like I actually buy everything on eBay, but kind of the truth of it, I probably did. So I bought a Mac Mini server from eBay a while back when I was doing some work with vSphere 4, because I was just curious to see whether I could get ESX running on it. Now, I'd say I never quite managed it in the vSphere 4 timeframe. When vSphere 5 came out, somebody had actually found out a way of customizing the VIBs so that you could install the drivers for the NICs on the Mac Mini, because I think the problems I'd had is you could boot a Mac Mini into ESX, but either the keyboard locked up or it didn't have drivers for the network card, and you couldn't really get any further. But actually, there is now a way of doing it. There's a link to a blog post there showing you how to do it and get it running. So, but the interesting bit about this is if you're going to run this at home, these boxes are absolutely silent. I mean, I don't know anybody who's seen a Mac Mini. I mean, you can't really see it from that picture, but they are like literally that big, maybe this square and flat. And I have one at home sitting underneath my monitor, which kind of tells you how small it is. So not only is it small and quiet, if you're in, if you live in an apartment or something like that, they aren't cheap because Apple make them, but it's a really nice way of getting a lab environment going that you can leave switched on in your apartment. But the really interesting bit is that anybody who's tried to install an Apple operating system into a virtual machine, you'll see that you're generally prevented from doing so. Now, as I understand it, this is actually, it's not necessarily a technical constraint, because let's be realistic, my Mac here has an Intel x86 processor, but there is so the code runs on it, but there is a technical and licensing agreement where you are prevented from installing it. However, the constraint, as I understand it, goes away if you're using it on Apple hardware. So interestingly, you can now install ESX on a Mac Mini, and you could then technically virtualize OS X, Snow Leopard, all the server variants, Mountain Lion, etc., inside a virtual machine on there, and it will all work. So kind of an interesting use case. So this is my current lab environment that I'm working with. So I'm in the middle of writing a few things, and I have a few side projects, so I needed a bit more horsepower to enable me to do that. So I did go out again on eBay and buy a DL380 G5. So I think the total cost all in for that DL380 G5 with 32 gigs of RAM, a bunch of local storage, worked out to about £1,000 UK pounds. So this has two purposes. So my office at home is actually in what is essentially a fancy shed at the end of my garden, and in winter it gets very cold. So on an ecological sense, this DL380 produces quite a lot of heat. So not only does it heat my office during the winter, it also deafens me when I'm working in there. However, on this I can run, so I basically on this at home I have 3 16-node clusters running as virtual machines. So it is that DL380 that you can see in the middle of the photograph there. It's running in total 48 instances of ESX. All of them think they have 16 gigs of RAM. So you imagine there's a heavy amount of oversubscription going on there. But it does mean I can spin up quite large and complicated workflows. So I'm doing a lot of work with vCloud Director at the moment. So I have that DL380 and those virtual machines essentially representing provider VDCs into my vCloud lab to enable me doing some of the work I'm doing. And I recycled actually those ML110s that I had into a management pod. So I have 2 ML110s with 8 gigs of RAM running vCenter, Active Directory, auto deploy, all those good things. And then my resource workloads essentially on that DL380. Now, I made that split for a very specific reason, rather than just running everything on that 380. As I mentioned, it is quite noisy, and I do work in that office from time to time, so it's not very pleasant with that sitting behind you. So because it has a built-in ILO, it means I can switch it off, but because the management pod's still there, all of the vCenter and everything are running 24/7, all my VPN servers, etc. But I can power up the big noisy thing when I need to do serious work, and then when I've finished I can switch it off again without interrupting other things. So on there I'm also running a number of other things. So I kind of touched on the virtual storage appliances. So it's running a mix actually of FreeNAS, OpenFiler. I have a physical iX4 NAS that I've had for a while, which is pretty good, if not the quickest. It's not the quickest bit of storage, but it works. And then also this NetApp Edge VSA, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. One interesting thing to know is all of these boxes boot from 2 gig USB flash drives. For me, it just makes it easy because I can take that flash drive out, upgrade the version of ESX it boots from, actually in a virtual machine on my laptop, unplug it, shove it back in the server, and it's running vSphere 5.1 instead of 5, for example. And it keeps all, if there's local storage, it then keeps all the local storage intact, so the installer doesn't overwrite it and those sort of things. So now, there are some considerations that I talked if you're going to run that kind of kit. So this is a reading from what that DL380 is idling at this morning, or yesterday morning, this morning. So, it's currently chewing through its way through about 260 watts. There aren't actually that many virtual machines powered on at the moment. If I power all of those 48 virtual machines on, you'll imagine it starts to crank the CPUs a bit more. And this usually runs around 450, 500 watts with everything going. So you can see why you wouldn't want to do that and leave it running for too long. An interesting aside, this server actually came from eBay. From Yahoo, because they left all the ILO bits intact when they sold it on eBay. So the last thing I wanted to look at, and this is something I've only done recently, so I have one of these microservers at home. If you go and talk to the guys on the NetApp booth, they can give you details of this, but you can download a software virtual machine version of the software that runs on the actual NetApp filer hardware. So, on a £120 bit of computer, I've got a bunch of local disks, and I'm actually running essentially a real, to all intents and purposes, NetApp filer within my office at home. So I think that's really cool. EMC did similar in the past with their VSA that NIC took and turned into that Uber VSA thing. There are some tweaks you need to do with this to make it happy, to stop it using all the CPU. But if you're in that kind of space where you're working with NetApp technology, I mean, I've never really touched NetApp before, and this has been really useful for me to try and understand how the console works and what kind of configurations you can do, because it has all the licenses, eval licenses for dedupe, cloning, replication, etc., etc., etc. So I'd encourage you to go and talk to the NetApp folks. And you know what? If you go near the HP stand, or you go near any other stand who has a storage vendor, I would just point them at that and say, look, why aren't you doing this? Because it's actually, for them it's very good promotional, but for you as techies and all of us as engineers, that is a brilliant way of learning new technology and encouraging your own management to buy vendor A's product. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. That was really cool. A lot of our audience, especially on the brown bag side, we're all constantly trying to figure out how to get our kit at home set up so that we can try these technologies, because as you said, that's where you actually build your skills. Well, unless you're really daring and go for it in production. So
yeah, and I think it's tricky. I mean, if I took my entire job description in a single line, I draw Visio diagrams and write Word documents for a living. Right. So you need to be able to have some space to do some hand-sort stuff. Otherwise, you just are so detached from it.
That's right. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate having you on again.